Okay, I have a very bad one. Why did the Syrian government not close any schools yet for the coronavirus? Because they prefer bombing their schools. Hello and welcome to the very first episode of Middle East.
What?
My name is Toby Schreiner, and today, for the very first episode of this YouTube channel, we're talking about something very simple and not complicated at all. The war in Syria and the 9th anniversary of the Syrian revolution. Please excuse my terrible sense of humor, but I can't help to become a bit cynical because the situation in Syria is so bad. So this is why you should care even in this time of corona panic everywhere. I initially wanted to visit the protest for the 9th anniversary of the revolution in London yesterday, but it was also cancelled. Thanks, coronavirus. 9 years ago today, a group of schoolboys sprayed a graffiti on a school wall in Daraa in the south of Syria saying, I have to start from here, right? Doctor, you're next, meaning Bashar al-Assad, the dictator of Syria. The boys were abducted by the security forces, tortured and killed, and then their maimed bodies were returned to their families. This sparked protests against the regime's brutality. The protests were brutally suppressed by the security forces, sparking bigger protests everywhere around the country. After more than 40 years of Assad family rule, a totalitarian dictatorship, deteriorating economic conditions, corruption, unemployment, and thousands of people being brutally murdered in the torture prisons of the regime, the Syrian people said, "Khalas, enough." This peaceful, popular uprising started off a violent revolution when the regime acted so brutally against its own people that normal civilians saw no other way than arming themselves and fighting against the state. However, Assad acted so brutally against his own people and systematically released jihadists from prison that this popular revolt coming from the grassroots of society was then overtaken by extremists. And it all got worse when international actors joined the stage and finally turned Syria into the bloody mess that it is today. In March 2018, that's 2 years ago, it was estimated that 500,000 people had died in the conflict. And since then, they simply stopped counting. According to UNHCR, more than 5.5 million people have fled the country as refugees, and that 6.5 million people at least are displaced within Syria. The conflict has taken so long and has become so complicated that most people simply stopped caring. But today, on the 9th anniversary of the revolution, it's time to tell people that the situation is still there, still going on, and it's as terrible as it's never been before. So share this, tell your friends, tell your family, and try to raise awareness. So, in this video, I'm going to give you a short overview of, first, who's still involved in the conflict in Syria, second, what they're doing, and third, what the future may hold for Syria. First, Bashar al-Assad. In 2012, it actually looked like Assad would lose the war because the rebels were taking over most of the important cities like Aleppo and Homs. But then Iran moved in and Hezbollah moved in, then Russia moved in. Assad now militarily controls most parts of Syria again, except from the areas controlled by the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, the areas controlled by Turkey, and Idlib, the last stronghold of the rebels, backed by Turkey. Assad was initially planning to do the same to Idlib what he had done to the rest of the country, which was bomb the living crap out of the civilians until everyone is either dead, runs away, or gives up. But Turkey moved in and enforced a ceasefire with the Syrian government, for which it is now praised by some as the savior of the people of Idlib. So what's next for the regime? There is no way that Putin will let anyone destabilize Syria again as it has happened in the past. As the Americans are gone now, Russia is the only superpower involved in the Syrian conflict, and neither the US, nor the UN, nor the EU can do anything to stop that. If we like it or not, we have to acknowledge that Assad has won the war. Idlib is just the last chapter of this bloody mess that was created because of the ruthlessness of a dictator that preferred killing and gassing his own people and bombing his entire country into the Stone Age just to stay in power. In the future, Assad will rule over ruins and people who hate him even more than before the war. Second, the Russians have entered the conflict in 2015, claiming that they would help the Syrian government against ISIS and against extremists. However, it has been proven countless times that the Russian military planes have systematically bombed civilians, including schools and hospitals. It's going to be quite difficult, though, to hold Russia to account for its war crimes in Syria because they have a seat in the UN Security Council, and in the past they have already blocked several resolution attempts of the UN to sanction the Syrian regime, together with China. Russia is now the only superpower left in Syria, and it's the most important backer of the Syrian regime. There's no way it will let Assad fall. And, if we like it or not, Russia will shape Syria's future for decades to come. Third, Iran and the Shia militias. The Quds Force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, once headed by Qasem Soleimani until he was assassinated by a US drone strike in January this year, saved Assad's ass in 2012 and 2013 when most of Syria was taken over by the rebels. Iran provided weapons, military training and millions of dollars in equipment to the Syrian regime and then mobilized Hezbollah to move into Syria and fight next to regime troops. Plus, it mobilized Shia militias from Iraq, Kataib Hezbollah and Nasaib Ahl al-Haq for the nerds among you. These Shia militias from Lebanon and from Iraq were some of the most important fighting force against ISIS on the ground, let's say after the Kurds in the north. While they don't play such an important role in the current stage of the conflict, the Shia militias and Hezbollah still control large parts of Syria. The critical question for the future of these militias is whether they will be sent back to Iraq and Lebanon or if they will stay in Syria and be included into the Syrian military. This would create a large demand for land and housing, and Assad has already thought of that. Assad already revoked the citizenships of many Syrians who fled the country and took away their right to their land to give it to militias. This issue is already happening right now and it will intensify in the future. Fourth, the rebels. While the rebels around the Free Syrian Army were actually doing quite well in the beginning of the war, the only area they're now controlling is Idlib. It is very sad to say, but the entire revolution that started as a popular uprising of normal people picking up guns against a terror regime has turned into a struggle of different extremist groups. The more violent the regime acted against the rebels, the more they were taken over by different jihadist groups. The proud Free Syrian Army has collapsed years ago and is now nothing more than a shadow of its old self, consisting of a group of different Islamist militias mostly fighting for Turkey. It is very sad to say, but the revolution has failed. Today there are basically no moderate groups in Syria left. Except from the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, but we're going to talk about that a bit later. But even though Assad, the Russians and Iran always claim that they're only fighting extremists, we must not forget that their attacks mostly target, hit and kill civilians. And right now, there are still 3 million people trapped in Idlib, of whom many already had to flee from other parts of Syria again and again until now. Fifth, Turkey. Mostly absent for large parts of the Syrian war, Turkey mostly made it to the headlines because it hosted the world's largest Syrian refugee population and because it allowed Islamist fighters to cross its borders and be treated in Turkish hospitals, also ISIS fighters. That changed with the Turkish invasions into the Kurdish-controlled parts of Syria. First, Afrin in January 2018 and then northeastern Syria in October 2019. Turkish President Erdogan is claiming that the YPG, the People's Protection Unit in northern Syria, is directly affiliated with the PKK in Turkey, the Kurdistan Workers' Party that has been waging an insurgency against the Turkish state and has been fighting for an independent Kurdish state in the region since the 1980s. Erdogan therefore picked up the phone and called US President Donald Trump, who had until then protected and supported the Kurds in northern Syria as the most important ally for the US in the fight against ISIS. After the phone call, Trump dropped the Kurds, stepped them in the back, and allowed Turkey to establish a security zone on its border that is now being patrolled by Turkish and Russian forces together. In the latest chapter of the war, Idlib, Turkey has been supporting Islamist rebels that are holding the area against the regime. The latest big news was the ceasefire between Turkey and Syria that Turkey has enforced by radically attacking Syrian forces that were bombing Idlib. And now in the press, Erdogan is cherished as the defender of the people of Idlib. Let's see how long that is going to last. Turkey has a huge agenda in northern Syria. Firstly, it was to prevent more Syrian refugees from crossing its borders. Secondly, it eyes on territory that was once part of the Ottoman Empire. And thirdly, it wants to get rid of the Kurds in northern Syria that it considers a threat. To make things complicated, Erdogan is enemies with Assad but friends with Putin, and Putin is friends with Assad. What can we expect from Turkey in the future? Well, Erdogan could try to invade the whole of Rojava, and that could unleash another humanitarian catastrophe. 6. The Kurds. The YPG, or People's Protection Unit, seemed like the biggest territorial winner after the Islamic State was defeated. They had carved out a large piece of land in the northeast of the country and established their own administration, a socialist, democratic and female liberation movement following the footsteps and ideology of PKK founder Abdullah Öcalan. With Erdogan becoming more and more aggressive, the entire Kurdish project in Rojava is under threat. The Kurds are now stuck between Turkey on one side and Russia on the other. If Turkey and Russia should strike a deal in the future, they could crush Rojava entirely. 7. The US and A. And there is a reason why the US are on the bottom of the list, because since Donald Trump's withdrawal from Syria, there are about roughly 500 US soldiers left in Syria who are now supposed to do the job of what before 2,000 American soldiers were doing, which is, first, protect the oil wells, second, to stop Turkey from going full berserk on the Kurds, third, preventing Russian-backed Syrian troops from attacking the Kurds, and fourth, keeping the Islamic State in check and preventing a resurgence of the terrorist group. And if you now think that this sounds like a tough job for 500 soldiers, I think we can all agree on that. With Donald Trump's withdrawal in October 2019, the US has officially become irrelevant for the future of Syria. The Russians can now do whatever they want in the country, and there's no one to keep them in check. Lastly, the Islamic State. The Caliphate is destroyed, the Islamic State is no more, and its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, has been killed. But even though they are not a territorial power anymore, Daesh is not defeated. There are still thousands of sleeper cells in Syria and in Iraq, staging more and more smaller terror attacks again. And there are also thousands of Kurdish fighters captive in Kurdish prisons in northeastern Syria. If Turkey should try to fully invade the whole of Rojava, we don't know what's going to happen to these prisoners. During Turkey's last invasion to Rojava in October 2019, we already saw many ISIS fighters escape. The more unstable the situation, the better the chances for ISIS to grow again. It is very likely that ISIS will return as an insurgency group, similarly to Al-Qaeda after the 2003 invasion to Iraq of the United States. But one thing is for sure, let's be clear here. The worse the situation for the civilian population is, the easier it is for radical jihadist groups to recruit new people. We currently see former ISIS fighters in Idlib fighting with the former Free Syrian Army, which were enemies before. And we even have reports of former ISIS fighters in Iraq joining the Hashd al-Shaabi, the Shia militias in Iraq. That makes no sense at all if you try to analyze this whole situation in religious or ideological terms. It makes sense though if you understand that for most people in a war zone, the only group they will support are the people who might be able to feed them and their loved ones for the next week. The next big chapter in Syria will be reconstruction. Who will rebuild Syria? Who will pay for it? Because you can be sure that there are a lot of companies already neatly lining up for these juicy contracts to transform all these cities that have been turned into rubble into some nice middle-class neighborhoods and glitzy shopping centers. Just look into the neighborhood. City center of Beirut after the Lebanese civil war? Anyone? The West has to face a very difficult question. Will the EU, the UN and all the Western governments engage in the reconstruction effort? Or will they completely reject all cooperation with the regime and leave the Syrian people to themselves and to the mercy of the Russians? If you want to know more about the topic of reconstruction in Syria, let me know in the comments below, because I think that topic might deserve a video on its own. Damn, that was complicated, wasn't it? Thank you so much for watching this video until the very end. I know it was a lot, but that's the Syrian conflict, and I don't even claim to have been talking about everything important. I think I left out a lot of things that I should have talked about. This is a very new YouTube channel, so please have some mercy with me. Just starting off, give me your feedback in the comments, like, subscribe, and hit that bell. Except from if you're an Assad supporter, I don't give a flying fuck about what you think. But yeah, I think then you would have probably not watched this video until the very end. Looking forward to producing more content for you, and yeah, don't worry. Not all of them are going to be so boring with me just explaining things. I'll be doing interviews, I'll be doing vlogs, and very cool stuff on this channel. So yeah, I'll be happy if you could join the Middle East family. And until then, see you, goodbye.